Hey guys, it's Maddie. We'll get into the superhero stuff in a second, but I think we need to start this off with a personal anecdote. A lot of you probably know that I currently live in Seattle, Washington, but I only moved here around 2 years ago. I grew up in the South, in an area that's frequently referred to as the Bible Belt. To be more specific, my family, mom, dad, myself, and 5 other siblings lived in a trailer park in North Florida while I was growing up. Our neighbors were mostly all my mother's family. Dad was and still is a staunch right-wing talk show host, and as such, both parents were typically Republican voters. We'd attend a Southern Baptist church every Sunday, and once mom and dad split, my siblings and I were put into Christian school from the time that I was in 4th grade up until I returned to public school in 10th grade. While I'll never say that there weren't plenty of well-meaning people living similar lives that I was in contact with on a day-to-day basis, I'd be lying if I said it was a very inclusive environment. I still remember when I was maybe 8 years old, my aunt suggesting that I was going to grow up to be the gay one in the family. Not knowing what this meant, I asked my parents when I got home. Needless to say, they were both very upset, and once I was told that gay people go to hell, you can imagine how upset I was as well. Flash forward to a 14-year-old version of myself in 2005. The emo movement is on the rise with bands like My Chemical Romance, Taking Back Sunday, and AFI all exploded in popularity. The Christian school I'm in at the time has a strict dress code, but a small number of students find ways to emulate the style displayed by these bands that we idolize. Wanting to be a part of something and have an outward display of my internal angst that so heavily connected me to that scene, I painted my nails black. Well, I Sharpied them black. It was all I had readily available at the time. Of course, when my dad picked my siblings and I up from school that afternoon, it was one of the first things that he noticed. "What's next? Are you going to start wearing dresses, shove melons down your shirt, and go kissing guys?" It brought me back to that 8-year-old version of myself. Honestly, part of me wonders if he remembered that conversation when he decided to have this one. These days, there are pictures readily available on the internet of me doing all 3 of those things that he was afraid of. At the time though, I had been dealing with suicidal thoughts and depression that both still haven't been properly taken care of to this day. Couple the fact that you want to kill yourself with the fact that you'll wind up burning in hell forever if you do because your dad thinks you're swinging a little too far into the queer side of life, and you can rest assured that there will be a lot of emotional turmoil going on. I say all of this to preface the point I want to make in this video, a similar point I made in our video on racial diversity in the DCAU. Representation matters. However, where the DC animated universe excelled in representation of some minority communities, other walks of life didn't get nearly as much of a spotlight. Go ahead and name an out LGBT character from any of these shows. I'll give you a few seconds in case you need the time. Chances are the most common answer given is going to be Poison Ivy and Harley Quinn. And sure, the two have become more widely written as LGBT characters in recent years, but there was never anything in the DCAU to clearly indicate such. At least, nothing as blatant as, say, this.
Call me.
Or this, even.
I'll call you.
In fact, even in the tie-in comic Batgirl Adventures, it's still only hinted at without being directly stated, and then brushed off for a laugh in suggesting that Batgirl and Supergirl are actually the lesbians here, a notion that Barbara Gordon seems to be repulsed by. Some of you might know by now that I'm not someone who typically gets upset by Bruce Timm being a bit heavy-handed with sexuality, but any implications of these two being together in the DCAU always felt like it was a fantasy fulfillment for him, rather than an attempt for realistic representation. Judging by this art that Timm drew, I wouldn't be surprised to find out that I'm right about that. Which, hey, I'm not here to judge or kink shame. You do you, boo. But during the show's original runs in the 90s and early 2000s, there was a huge demographic that was underrepresented and alienated as a result. The lack of representation in pop culture did nothing to help normalize the community, and as such, many people continue to treat them as the other. Despite these shows taking potshots at the LGBT community, between both that comic panel and, well, this.
I love Batman. All those muscles, the tight rubber armor, and that flashy car. I heard it can drive up walls. You should have seen the fire. It was fabulous.
There were subtle attempts to sneak in LGBT representation, perhaps the most notable being the character of Maggie Sawyer.
She was a lesbian in the comics.
Yep.
And we decided to kind of go with that in the animated version of her. We didn't hit the audience over the head with it, but there are a couple subtle nods to her orientation.
In a later episode where she's wounded in the line of duty, we have her partner at her bedside with her in the hospital, and it's a very subtle thing. If she was a male police officer, her partner, or his partner, would be there with him, so we just kept it the same.
Mm-hmm.
Introduced in Superman number 4, Maggie's character was created for the 1987 relaunch of the Superman comics. It wasn't until the following year, in issue number 15, that she came out as a lesbian, though. A little over a year before the story takes place, Maggie was still married to her husband, Captain James Buchanan Sawyer. In a heart-to-heart moment with Superman, Maggie explained her confusion, that things were happening in her head that she had been denying for a long time due to her Catholic upbringing. And now she thought that maybe if she settled down with Jim, that it would put an end to that struggle for her. However, with the two having nothing in common, the marriage began to fall apart, a fate that the introduction of a child wasn't able to mend. Eventually, James stopped coming home most nights, and Maggie began to come face to face with herself and the reality of her sexual identity, leading to their split altogether, as well as custody of her child being withheld. Of course, with this being in the 80s, times were much different than they are today. The Comics Code Authority, first established in 1954 as a way to allow for self-regulation of comics without government interference, was still in full force. While the rules would get more relaxed over time, to the point where they eventually abandoned it altogether, up until 1989, the portrayal of LGBT characters wasn't allowed at all. As such, Maggie's story had to be told in subtext rather than outright stated. Even though that section of the Comics Code was abandoned almost a full decade prior to Superman the Animated Series, the political climate still didn't allow for much LGBT representation in animation, and thus, while directly referenced, Maggie Sawyer's orientation was still only a subtle detail. However, Maggie isn't the only character in the DCAU to be confirmed LGBT, and I'm not talking about Fire. Although,
I hear she's, Brazilian.
Ha ha.
No, I'm actually talking about Static's best friend, Richie Foley. Mostly based off the Milestone comic Static, when making its way from print to the animated Static Shock TV show, a large amount of the property was tweaked in order to cater to the show's younger audience. Among these tweaks was the transformation from Rick Stone to Richie Foley. Rick had been a member of the Static cast of characters as early as the very first issue, but it wasn't until the 1994 story arc, What Are Little Boys Made Of, that Rick's character began to really take shape. Interspersed with the typical superpowered comic book fare, What Are Little Boys Made Of takes a huge focus on Rick publicly coming out as a gay man after being jumped by a group of skinheads outside of a support group he had secretly been attending, and realizing that he wouldn't easily be able to hide the wounds from his friends. In present day, one might not see coming out as a big deal anymore, but in the climate of the 90s, it led to a fallout with all of his male friends due to the fear that they would also be perceived to be gay. After a conversation where Frida points out how awful Virgil is acting, everything comes to a head when he tries to make amends by shutting down violent anti-LGBT protesters who showed up to a rally that Rick was a part of. Despite this story, or really any story regarding Richie's orientation, never playing out in the TV show, Dwayne McDuffie did address the matter in 2005, stating, "It'll never come up in the TV show because it's Y7, but as far as I'm concerned, Richie is gay." And later adding on, "The way I dealt with Richie's homosexuality was to write him aggressively and unconvincingly announcing his heterosexuality whenever possible. Wow, look at those girls in the swimsuits, I sure like girls," while Virgil rolled his eyes at the transparency of it. Dwayne McDuffie was fantastic at getting progressive points across in his writing, whether it be Static Shock or elsewhere, but his point about not being able to openly represent LGBT characters in cartoons still rang true years later. For instance, earlier this year when Giancarlo Volpe, producer of Green Lantern the Animated Series, was asked about LGBT representation in the show, he responded, "If anyone was LGBT in Green Lantern, it was sadly subtle and underplayed. There's a scene where Drusa admires Aya's robotic body that I always thought doubled as being attracted to her. Also, it seems the Star Sapphires would be, given the way they use men as power batteries. However, I am aware that suddenly declaring characters gay long after the show is over is not the best way to be inclusive. At the time, we played it subtle because we thought that's the most we could get away with." And he's right. In 2011, subtlety was all you could get away with on Cartoon Network. Greg Weisman, showrunner of Young Justice, went into a bit more detail regarding the network at the time. In 2012, amid the airing of Young Justice's second season, a fan by the name of Derek wrote to Greg saying, "We're only 6 episodes in, so naturally not everything and everyone has been fleshed out for this season yet, including the minority characters. I'm part of a minority too. I'm gay, and we haven't been referenced at all in Young Justice, which I view as a flaw. However, if we were, I would be happy with the kind of portrayal that the other minority cast members have received. The minority characters in Young Justice are being treated as characters like any other. Some are more prominent than others, but that's the same for the white characters too. Connor is a far bigger character in the series than Wonder Girl, for example. In Young Justice, you have minority characters in big roles as both villains and heroes. In my opinion, having a diverse representation of minorities is far superior to just favorable tokenism. We're all people and we're all fallible. If anything, I think Aqualad in the first season could be seen as favorable tokenism because he was too perfect. He's far more interesting to me now that we can see that he's flawed." To which Greg ended up responding, "I suppose it goes without saying that we didn't view Aqualad ever as a token of any sort. We were characterizing him based on his background, heritage, and experience. If that's paying off more in season 2, well, great. But we believe he's been Calder as we saw Calder from day one. I also believe we have differently oriented characters in the series, even though we're not allowed to mention it out loud. And just to be sure, I checked to see if we were allowed and got a no answer. Everyone seems to want to get there, but we're not there yet." Despite how frustrating it is to see Greg's hinting at LGBT representation and not being able to deliver on screen, I take him at his word that it's something he wants to dive into. In fact, LGBT representation seems to be something Greg has been passionate about, even going back to his days working on Disney's Gargoyles, something he opened up even more about in 2005. "In my opinion, Lexington is gay, though he may not yet realize it, and that we would be consistent with that knowledge, as I believe we have been up to this point. But that in the current world climate, we would not be addressing it on the show at all, not explicitly or implicitly. It's a damn shame, and since we're talking about episodes that don't exist, it would be easy for me to be brave now and pretend that we'd be open about it, but that would be a lie of expectation, and I try to be more honest than that with the fans. All I promised was consistency. It may sound like a subtle distinction, but believe me, it is not. It may also sound like a cop-out, and believe me, it is, but it's a cop-out that comes out of the fact that if I even attempted an implicit portrayal, it flat out would not get on the air, and I could stand my ground, and I would get fired, and then there'd be no consistency either. Someday I hope to live in a braver, more understanding world, but we ain't there yet, and I think what we're doing is at least a step in the right direction." Luckily though, we don't have to just take Greg's word at face value. As recently as 2017, he took to Twitter to reiterate that there are already LGBT characters in Young Justice, and when asked about it, he suggested reading the tie-in comics to this show, which he had an active role in writing. So, I did just that. Honestly, it's still a bit more on the subtle side, but not quite as subtle as most of the other examples I've gone over so far. In fact, there's a whole page dedicated to setting up a relationship between Marie Logan, mother of Beast Boy, with Queen Bee. However, these aren't the only queer characters on the show. Shortly after his tweet on the matter, another fan asked Greg about it on his website, to which he responded, "We've established that Marie Logan was either a lesbian or bisexual. In my mind, Yes, there are other LGBTQ characters in the series as well, but I am not promising anything at all about what will be revealed or seen in Season 3. There hasn't been any official announcement just yet as to who else he may be referring to, but between this tweet from 2013 implying that Aqualad may not be straight, this panel from issue number 0 of the tie-in comic where Aquaman suggests he'd be a poor king were he not to allow the freedom of expression, and the fact that his comics continuity counterpart is also gay, it seems as though Aqualad is a strong contender. But he may not be the only one. With Batwoman having been brought into Season 3 for cameo appearances, there may be a lot of great things on the horizon as far as LGBT representation goes for Young Justice.
So, you're a cop?
A detective. You have a problem with that?
No, not at all. You just don't look the part.
What's a cop supposed to look like?
Not as hot as you. Did I just say that out loud?
Yeah, you did.
In the years since Young Justice left the air, Batman Bad Blood finally gave us our first openly lesbian couple in DC animation, with Kate Kane's Batwoman and Renee Montoya.
Call me.
Unlike Richie Foley and Maggie Sawyer, this side of Renee and Kate wasn't part of either of their characters until after their appearances in the DCAU. Created specifically for Batman the Animated Series, Renee Montoya was a secondary character who wasn't more fleshed out until she began to appear in the comics. In 2004's Gotham Central, Renee was publicly outed as a lesbian to both her workplace and her family, which resulted in her life being completely turned upside down. Kathy Kane, or Kathy Duquesne in the DCAU, had been introduced much earlier in 1956's Detective Comics number 233 and retired 23 years later when her character was killed off in 1979. It wasn't until almost 30 years after that Batwoman would return in DC's 52 book. Now, however, Kate was being billed as a lesbian, and man, it seems like the outrage over inclusion in comics is cyclical. Those arguments you hear from comic skaters these days are the same thing they were saying in 2006. While I was looking up info for this section of the video, I came across this Angry Mom's website, and I just gotta read some of it because it's just too funny. As a mother of 6 children, I was disgusted by the BBC report of DC Comics' Batwoman hero returns as lesbian. I think it's time that Catholics wage a boycott and protest of this outrageous assault on the innocence of our youth, some of whom read this popular comic magazine. If this kind of perverse subject matter is allowed to be placed on the pages of DC Comics, then you can be assured that other lesbian and homosexual comic book characters like it will eventually end up in our Sunday newspaper comic section and on our movie screens. Children go see movies like Superman and Batman, and there is definitely an agenda at work here. We are being morally shaped by the media to accept sexual deviance of every kind. This is a disgrace. To send us in 2006 a lesbian comic book character for children to emulate. Everyone who has children knows that sometimes children play Superman or Batman and Robin. Could this have anything to do with the push in Congress to pass the federal marriage amendment that defines marriage as the union of a man and a woman? The vote was scheduled for June 6, 2006. 666, and as expected, did not pass. Clearly, the globalist revolutionary agenda is to make homosexual marriage legal in all countries, and to do this, they must reach the minds of our youth. I think this woman was just extra mad since her name was Kathleen and it's pretty close to Kathy, but I digress. 10 years later, Kathleen's worst fear would come true, and we would get to see Kate and Renee's relationship come to life in Batman Bad Blood. June 26th, I woke up hungover from partying the night before, ringing in my birthday with all my friends, to find out that the party would go on the rest of the day because love won out in the court system and marriage equality was now law of the land. Some may point to this as the reason for why Warner Brothers would have finally become comfortable with an animated same-sex couple, but while this all occurred 6 months prior to the film's release, the production cycle of these films typically takes roughly 2 years. So this was in the works since before then even. Either way, it's starting to seem as though maybe we've gotten to the braver, more understanding world that Wiseman had been hoping for. With cartoons such as Adventure Time, Steven Universe, Clarence, and now even Arthur starting to tackle the subject of LGBT representation, it seems as if we're in a new age of entertainment, where rather than representation being subtle or solely coming out stories, stories, the LGBTQ community has finally become normalized and the audience can begin to grow alongside characters from broader walks of life than we were able to in the 90s. This goes even further than animation though. Even though representation has always been a bit easier to include in live action programming due to an older target audience, I think DC should be applauded for just how much they've been doing in this realm. Admittedly, I don't watch a lot of the CW shows other than Black Lightning and Riverdale, but that's neither here nor there. But just looking at this list of LGBT characters throughout all of the shows in the Arrowverse is astounding, and not something that many other companies really even try to do. It's also of note that Greg Berlanti, producer and showrunner for the shows that make up CW's version of the DC universe, is a gay man himself, which may be a contributing factor to the magnitude of inclusion in these shows, which just goes to show that it's important to have representation behind the scenes as well. But on the subject of live action representation, I wanted to take a minute and talk about Doom Patrol. If you've yet to see the show because you don't have the DC Universe app or the app just isn't available in your country yet, Doom Patrol is a masterclass in absurd meta humor that focuses on a ragtag band of outcasts from different time periods who have all been brought together due to a scientist named Niles Calder giving them superpowers that also serve to extend the character's lifespan. While the story of Larry Traynor, Negative Man, does primarily deal with him coming to terms with his sexuality, a huge trope in LGBT storytelling, Doom Patrol handles it in a much more extensive manner than any similar story that I've personally seen. The show's 8th episode, Danny Patrol, focuses on Negative Man and Cyborg attempting to find Niles, following a lead to Danny, a living, talking street who, well...
Danny's genderqueer, and they use non-binary pronouns.
As a sentient street, Danny is able to relocate from place to place and over the years has helped give a home to those who have fallen through society's cracks, all while trying to keep hidden from the Bureau of Normalcy, a government agency meant to keep anything abnormal in check. However, during his investigation of the street years earlier, Bureau agent Morris Wilson came to a self-realization similar to Maggie Sawyer from earlier.
A weight had been lifted off me. I felt lighter. Like I was more myself than I had ever been.
Like I said though, this isn't a typical coming out story. Sure, a large amount of the narrative does play into the mold of coming out tropes, but Danny Patrol also serves as a celebration of finding community that you belong to, and acts as a reminder of how important representation of marginalized communities is. Towards the end of the episode, there's this absolutely beautiful moment. I wish we could play out the whole scene. Larry and Agent Wilson, now going by the name Maura Lee, duet a karaoke rendition of Kelly Clarkson's People Like Us. The whole 3 minutes of the two singing becomes an outright celebration of both characters having accepted their individuality and being embraced by the community who lives on Danny Street. A celebration that's so rare to see in pop culture that even just re-watching the scene out of context of the rest of the episode makes me teary-eyed. The waterworks hit even harder though when the party comes to an abrupt end and we're left with the realization that Larry had been daydreaming the entire scenario. For nearly 60 years, Larry lived ashamed of who he was and felt the need to keep it a secret from the world. A fear that became so rooted into him as a person that he still felt discomfort in the idea of openly expressing himself among those he could identify with. A fear that many people still live in. Despite the advances that have been made in the last couple of decades, it's abundantly obvious that there are still substantial reasons why those in the LGBT community may feel uncomfortable being open about who they are. And this is why it's important to have these walks of life mirrored in our media. While DC and Warner Brothers may not have the best track record in the past, the openness that they've begun to display in recent years is important. When we see these characters on screen, not only does it allow people in the LGBT community the chance to see relatable stories, but it also helps to normalize people who have been treated as social outcasts for far too long. It allows for the audience to see experiences of people they may not interact with on a day-to-day basis and empathize with their plight. It serves as a reminder of how insane it is to mistreat people on the basis of who they love, and it opens their eyes to the fact that this group, who so often gets treated as the other, are people too.
No one should ever have to feel uncomfortable in their own skin.
They all seem pretty happy to me.
Trust me, those people are scared. But still, they show up with a brave face and come anyway.
I started this video with a personal anecdote, and I guess good writing requires that I bring things back around to where I started. Leaving behind the closed-minded environment that I was subjected to when I was younger, I became friends with many people in the LGBT community. And through exposure, I came to realize that they weren't the living, breathing manifestation of evil that I had been brought up to believe that they were. In the years since growing up and moving out on my own, my eldest sister has come out as bisexual. My youngest brother is gay. But I guess some of you might be wondering if I grew up to be the big gay that my family was terrified of. If I'm being completely honest with you guys, I was a bit of a late bloomer. Past the gay bashing my family subjected myself and my siblings to while growing up, there was this whole weird thing that whenever I was obviously interested in a girl, I would be subjected to even more derision by the adults in the house. As a result, I didn't have my first girlfriend until my senior year of high school, and even then there was anxiety about it. My past and current relationships have all been with people of the opposite sex, but even then I'd be lying if I were to say that there haven't been guys that have caught my eye and left me thinking, oh, he's cute. Perhaps my lack of exploration into further options is just rooted in that same anxiety. Honestly, I'm not really sure where to end this video, so I guess here is as good as a place as any. Representation matters. Happy Pride Month, you guys, and thanks for watching. Alright, and stop.